is our Dharma? What is our quest? How's it going, everyone? This is Matt from Dharma Nights. So I recorded a walkthrough and review of a cheat sheet that I put together for my current 300 level Yoga Teacher Trainee students. There's a final exam at the end of their 300 level Yoga Teacher Training program, and I usually put together a roundup of the most important takeaways that I want them to have by the end of the course. So this ended up being something like an hour and 20 minutes long, way longer than I expected. So I'm cutting this up into a few different slices. And for those of you who are not in a yoga teacher training program, maybe you still enjoy this kind of stuff. Hopefully, either way, it has value for you. But certainly for my students, you guys should definitely have a bite-sized resource now that should help you feel a little bit more confident about some of the stuff that I included in that sheet. Namaste. Welcome to Dharma Nights. This is your host, Matt Murphy. Today, I wanted to do a podcast where I basically go through an exam prep sheet for my yoga teacher training students. I teach yoga philosophy, yoga history, basically all the jnana yoga topics, meaning like the yoga of intellect. And at the end of our particular yoga teacher training program that we do at Thrive Yoga and Fitness, there's a final exam. And we've done this at the 200 level and also at the 300 level. We're doing the same thing now. One of the consistent bits of feedback I get from my students is they're kind of overwhelmed as far as the scope of what I present throughout the course. I go pretty deep and I go pretty wide. Everything from the history to reviews of specific sacred texts and different traditions. We go pretty deep and pretty wide. So while I'm conscious that the students get a little overwhelmed and I tell them in advance that they are going to, I usually communicate like, hey, my real purpose here is not for you to be able to perfectly memorize all the things that we're going over here. It's to create little indexes of recognition in your mind for all the time that you're going to spend from now forward on your own studies. So, it kind of puts the choice in the student's hand where if they say to themselves, like, hey, this yoga journey for me is mostly about asana, and that's really what gets my juices flowing. They have that option to kind of just remain in that kind of sphere of interest, in that particular limb of yoga, right? But for all of those who actually do develop an interest in a lot more of the philosophical underpinnings or some of the metaphysics or the spiritual aspects of it, they get these little points of introduction that they're going to recognize later. When someone, whether in conversation or in written form, presents them with a whole bunch of Sanskrit words that ordinarily they wouldn't have come across, or some concepts that they wouldn't have come across, that can be a little overwhelming, and that can make them feel less than in that situation. That can make them suddenly bubble up with imposter syndrome, and none of that stuff is ever a great feeling, right? Everyone wants to feel like they're on this authentic journey in their yoga exploration, right? And, this is a completely different topic, but in most ways, I kind of think people are on an authentic journey, whether or not they realize it, from whatever angle they're approaching their yoga. So, but that's kind of a topic for a different day, and that's a philosophy that I'll get into some other time. But what I very highly value in terms of my ability to give people information is just to give them those little points of introduction where they're not going to instantly be overwhelmed when they encounter some of this stuff assumptively elsewhere. Like, again, earlier I mentioned in conversation, someone might be throwing out a bunch of these Sanskrit words, or they might be reading a text which assumes familiarity with some of these concepts, like at a foundational level, And that part might just not be registering with them at all because they didn't even have a basic introduction to it. So kind of as a way to compensate for this, since I'm conscious that the students are potentially a little overwhelmed with exactly how much I'm exposing them to, pretty much the entire time I try to assure them, like, hey guys, yes, there is an exam, but I try to make sure that you're well prepared for it in terms of like what material I share ahead of time, in terms of a summary. And at the 200 level, at least, I've actually prepared like physical printout cheat sheets, so to speak, where if there's not something on that sheet, it doesn't show up on the exam, period. So part of that, when I approach it at that level, is just to make sure that they can be aware that they might experience some of that feeling of overwhelm, but as much as possible, put it on a shelf because they know they're going to be well taken care of by the time the actual exam comes. And the hope is that once they have that kind of disclaimer early enough, that they can just sort of buckle in and experience the sort of fire hose of information, so to speak, more with curiosity and engagement rather than like anxiety and dread, right? So one of the things that I'm going to do for this particular year of students for the 300 level is I'm also dedicating this episode of my podcast to go through the sort of cheat sheet that I put together for them. And this one is a little bit longer than the one that I would do for the 200 levels because, there is a little bit of an expectation that they're going just a little bit deeper into some of this stuff than they would have at the 200 level. But the core of what I go over is still basically the same in terms of like what my realistic scope of expectation is for them. I still try to keep it pretty high level as far as what concepts I expect them to be able to feel comfortable answering on an exam. And it's like sort of for me, I could pick any number of different concepts to narrow it down to, but there are a few for me that I choose because I want them to see the development of yoga on sort of a historical trajectory where different metaphysical ideas at different times contributed different things to yoga as a practice and as a way of approaching and understanding the world, right? So with that kind of explanation out of the way first, let's dive right into it. So the very first question I ask the questions that I ask once I give it to Erin, who runs the program, she can put these in whatever randomized order she wants. But in terms of the students reviewing and the priority that I put on this stuff, the very first question I ask is, what is Dharma? Right? And the 2 bullet point condensed answer that I provide here has sort of a tall order in terms of giving as simple as possible an explanation for such a complex concept that we don't really have a direct one-to-one translation for in the West, right? But the question is, what is Dharma? And the first bullet point I provide says, an individual's duty most often fulfilled by observance or custom or law, though Dharma must sometimes be satisfied beyond the law when rulers or countries are corrupt. And we see a lot of that, for example, in the story of Mahabharata. There are kings, they enforce their laws, but in that case, they are a bunch of corrupt kings, and Krishna, as, supreme god of the universe in human avatar, says, hey, you got to break rules and behave dishonorably on the battlefield for the greater good of restoring Dharma to the world, right? So, once again, an individual's duty most often fulfilled by observance of custom or law, though Dharma must sometimes be satisfied beyond the law when rulers or countries are corrupt. Second bullet point I put there is, Dharma is rooted in concern for the other's hungers and fears, as in not just your own. So Dharma then becomes the opposite of Matsya Nyaya, or law of the fishes, which would be kind of a counterpart in the West to law of the jungle, right? So in law of the jungle or law of the fish, might makes right. Whoever's strongest makes the rules and they do what they want, and whoever's weak just has to put up with it, suffer it, etc. But Dharma is the opposite. Dharma says, no, 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 kind of like King Arthur would say, right makes might. Dharma concerns itself with the hungers and fears of the other, unlike an animal. An animal is mostly concerned with its own hungers and fears, but in a society of human beings with Dharma, there is concern for the other. What are their fears? What can I know about their hungers, and how can I help satisfy their hungers? So that's my, in a nutshell, answer for Dharma, which leads us to what is karma, right? And karma and Dharma are concepts that feed into each other intimately, okay? So what is karma? First bullet point I have says, most simply, actions have consequences, both individually and collectively. So an individual can incur karma, like the consequences of their actions, and the society, beyond the scope of an individual, can incur karma. And again, karma is not necessarily good, it's not necessarily bad, and it's not even the biblical version of you reap what you sow. It's more like the laws of physics saying action-reaction. Take away the value judgment part of it that says good karma, bad karma, which has echoes of like good person, evil person. It's not that. It's just actions have consequences. And sometimes those consequences are symmetrical. And certainly in the stories in the Hindu and yogic tradition, they demonstrate karma's consequences very symmetrically, right? So, as an example, in the Mahabharata, when, let's say, just like one particular colorful example, when the Pandavas are cheated out of their kingdom in a game of dice, meaning their cousins used treachery and cheated them out of their kingdom and their freedom and all that other stuff. Then when it comes time for the final battle, here comes Krishna saying, okay, now Pandavas, it's your turn to cheat. And that's your cousin's karma. That's your enemy's karma. So, again, I picked an example that sounds like kind of judgy and has that value judgment thing. It's kind of hard not to in some case, but it's such a perfectly graphic example of karma in that case. So, one other bullet point that follows, I say karma's consequences will influence one's rebirth conditions in Hindu's way of thinking. So that means something I do in a past life can make me incur a karmic consequence in the next life. It can even influence how I'm born. So one example, if I performed unrighteous actions in a former life as a prince, maybe that next life I'm born as someone who royalty would be likely to abuse or misuse or something like that, right? So kind of like the shoe is on the other foot now. Again, that sounds kind of value judgy, not my intention, but it's just that's one of the most colorful ways that we can kind of understand this concept. So one other bullet point I mentioned for karma and its definition, mostly because it makes it memorable, not even the gods in the Hindu myths and stories are above the law of karma. So Indra, who's the king of the Devas, he's not necessarily a perfectly virtuous being. He makes mistakes. He does things that influence his own action-reaction consequences, sometimes very colorfully when we get into the Puranic stories. So even the gods are beholden to the law of karma. So in this worldview, that tells you just how powerful a force they think karma is. It kind of like dictates the behavior of the entire universe. And there's very few beings that seem to have the option of being above karma in a like totality sort of sense, should they choose for that option. For example, Vishnu, when he's not an avatar form, he can be above the law of karma. Same thing with Shiva. When Vishnu does take human avatar form, he's beholden to the laws of karma too. So for example, some of the Pandavas' enemies end up cursing Krishna based on their reaction to Krishna helping the Pandavas win. So, for example, Gandhari, who's the mother of all of the Kauravas, or the Pandavas' enemies, she curses Krishna because in her eyes, Krishna is the reason that all of her sons die at the end of this great war. Not their own actions, not their own wickedness, not anything else. She saw that Krishna was helping the Pandavas, and then she lays a curse at Krishna's feet, saying, you two are going to see your whole clan die. And indeed, that curse becomes true. So Krishna has to sort of distantly witness the collapse of his extended clan. By the end of the Mahabharata story, his whole clan gets wiped out, right? So the curse of Gandhari comes true, which means even Krishna, as an avatar of Vishnu, is beholden to the law of karma. When he's in the higher realms, he's above karma, just like Shiva. When Shiva is in his transcendent mode, they're both above karma. And part of the yogic project is, as much as possible, to, like, for real people, is to reduce your karmic footprint as much as possible. So as you're doing yoga, as you're following the advice of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, to do bhakti or karma yoga or all these things, you're doing things with a higher level of consciousness so that you reduce your karmic footprint on the world and you incur less karma. So, next question I have for my students in this exam is, what are the Vedas? And the answer here is, the Vedas are a collection of hymns and rituals orally transmitted and preserved since at least the Vedic Iron Age. So, we could really expand that answer, but that is the sweet spot and the most important thing that I want my students to know. So when the Aryan people, we could say when the Vedic people settled in the Indian subcontinent, coming through the Khyber Pass, and that itself is a point of debate in India to this day, and it can verge on a religious debate. But for those who do kind of recognize the theory that there were, Indo-Aryans who crossed the Khyber Pass, came into the Indian subcontinent from the northeast, and settled further and further south over a period of time. They brought the Vedas with them, and that was their cultural material. It was orally transmitted, which is why it was preserved with such shocking fidelity. That's another little quirk that my students will learn in this course, is that cultures who preserve things orally end up preserving them with much more accuracy than written cultures, or cultures that preserve things in writing. Because when people write things, suddenly errors get introduced. Individual transcribers can inject their own wacky stuff into it. But when they have an oral culture where it's a certain group in that society has a dedicated job for their entire life to preserve these materials in pristine, flawless, reproducible, teachable frames, this stuff gets preserved with a shocking degree of accuracy over a very long period of time. And that's exactly what the Vedic people did with the Brahmins. The Brahmins in their society were walking encyclopedias. From a very young age, they had to be able to memorize, recite, and perform this set of hymns and rituals. So, why are the Vedas important? Principally because they contain the foundations of, quote, Vedic, unquote, culture, Hindu religion, and mythology, and also much of its metaphysics. So, a lot of this stuff started with the Vedas. I'm not going to say all of it, and that itself is like I don't have this particular part in my exam, but just for my students who are reviewing this to remember, we have the Pashupati seal, which predates the Vedic Iron Age, where they had the Indo-Aryans coming into the Indian subcontinent, meaning like the people who were in the civilizations before, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, they had that seal, which shows an early form of Shiva sitting in cross-legged meditation posture. And both myself and many others have spilled a lot of ink on this topic, saying like people were doing some form of postural yogic discipline since before the Indo-Aryans came to the Indian subcontinent. And at some point, the thought that many people, myself included, have is that there was like a cross-pollination of this embodied practice and the Vedic materials, and they kind of braided together at some point in history. But and then you have guys like Sadhguru, the popular Indian yogic guru, who says, his account of history is that there was Adi Yoga 70,000 or so years ago, who we commonly today refer to as like Shiva, like he was the historical sort of Shiva figure who came down with some sort of embodied yogic practice, taught it to a small handful of disciples all the way until today. In a lineage, we have the remnants of that practice. And that's it. For me and for lots of other people, we see that as sort of like a mythological origin story. For many people, though, that is like a very literally true origin story. But in terms of the Vedas and why they're important, they contained the foundations of Vedic culture, Hindu religion and mythology, and also much of its metaphysics. Not necessarily the very origin of anything yogic, but when we're talking about all these quintessentially Vedic ideas, they came from the Vedas themselves, and they were later elaborated in other materials like the Upanishads, like a lot of the other sutras, certainly in the Bhagavad Gita, in the epic materials too, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, all the way later into the Yoga Sutras, on and on and on and on. But a lot of the fundamental metaphysical building blocks that they're drawing from are concepts that are mentioned at one point or another in the Vedas. And some, like karma or Dharma, are actually rarely mentioned at all in the Vedas, and they don't seem to have the same scope of importance that they do today, but they are at least mentioned somewhere in some of the Vedas. So my next question leading out of that is, what are the Upanishads? And I just mentioned that in my explanation of the Vedas, right? So the Upanishads are a large collection of sacred books for the Hindu people, and they originate sort of just after the Vedas, right? They're placed at the end of the Vedas, and they primarily deal with knowledge and wisdom, and that's what my bullet point says, but just to expand on that a little bit. So we have the Vedas. The Vedas are not necessarily like philosophical essay explications of concepts. They just mention concepts. They might mention these concepts in hymn format or within the bounds of like a ritual that's supposed to be like recited, but they don't necessarily say what is X, what is Y, right? They don't say like, what is Prakriti, what is Purusha, what is Karma, what is Dharma, on and on and on and on. But the Upanishads do that, right? So in Greece, we have this moment where in Athens, we have a bunch of pre-Socratic philosophers, and then we have Socratics and Sophists, and they start to actually have discussions where they try to hash out what's real, what's true. And they have philosophical dialogues. So this is a similar moment in the Indian subcontinent, but rather than having like the format of very adversarial, sort of litigious sounding arguments like they are in the Socratic dialogues, and I'm not picking on them because I love them, they're great, but it's not really like that in the Upanishads. It's more like in the format of either teachers discussing among themselves or teachers explaining things to students. So it doesn't have quite that same aggressive, adversarial, argumentative tone that a lot of the like Socratic dialogues have, and that other philosophy in the West will have after that. It has a little bit more reverence, and it's usually from the viewpoint of teachers sort of lecturing to students. Sometimes teachers discussing among other teachers, but it's mostly like, students learning at the feet of their teacher. And in these Upanishads, they're reconciling concepts that are mentioned in the Vedas for maybe the first significant time, in written form anyway, They're seeing which things are contradictory, which things they can align, how they can put all these ideas together in sort of a consistent worldview. And that's one of the primary values of the Upanishads.